kind of theory-driven approach together with a data-driven approach. Because if you think about the regression trees and the classification trees, okay, it's essentially a data-driven approach. You just select, your Y, the covariates, and then let the algorithm do the splits, create the tree. Okay. In this case, you define the model. Okay. When I say model, imagine in your head a regression model. Okay. It can be a OLS, it can be a logistic regression, it can be any form of regression model. Okay. It can be a bit more complex than that, but let's say a regression model. And normally, you define the regression model. You decide, which are the predictors, which are in your regression model. But then, what you do is, you look how this model performs, not only, so to speak, on average, meaning how it fits well on your entire data set, but how it conditionally fits to subgroups of your data set. Okay? And how does it do that? So what you do is essentially in a few steps. You first establish a parametric model. Now we see it can also be non-parametric in some implementation of this latest implementation of this technique. Which usually is expressed by kind of theory-driven set of hypotheses. You have a model, you want to test that kind of model. Okay? And by the way, in the case of an experiment, it's pretty straightforward. It's a model where you try to test if your treatment works or not. Okay? So you actually have, we see some advantages of using data from randomized control trial into this, plugging into this, because you can be sure that, for example, covariates are equally distributed among both control and the treatment group, because that's the point of randomizing groups. Okay. But you start with a model. And second, what you do is, the model is evaluated to the model-based recursive partitioning algorithm that checks whether other important covariates have been omitted that would make the parameters of the initial model variate a lot. So the logic is, and I'll show it. So imagine that we have a very simple model that has only two predictors, okay? And our algorithm creates the splits like we have seen before. And the splits is based on the idea that the betas of your predictors, okay, substantially, statistically speaking, vary a lot from the global model, so the main model that you carried out at the beginning, so that the split is created. So what you find here is 3 nodes where the beta 1 values, let's say your first predictor, the betas of your first predictor, in one case is 22.5, in another one is minus 0.02, and the other one is minus 25.3. So what is telling you? It's telling you that in your same model, okay, maybe the overall in your overall model, the beta value was something positive, I don't know, 0.10 or something like that. Okay? This algorithm will split it into 3 because there is a subgroup of people where this predictor is actually more important than you thought. Okay? For another group of people, it's actually not important at all, and for another, it's important, but in the opposite direction of others. So it's, in a way, detrimental to whatever Y you're measuring. Okay? Same story can happen to another predictor and so on. So what happens is you start to have a global model, then this model splits in subgroups because the betas of your model start to vary enough to generate a split. And of course, how you generate a split will come into the details, but there are different ways that you can decide how the split should be made and so on. But the point here is that you look at this, the splits creates a subgroup that basically has a model that is still the same model that you used globally, but different weights, because that's what really betas are, given by a particular group of people, which is defined, the group of people are defined by, as in the previous trees, by combination of covariate values. Okay? Now, imagine a case where, again, you have a different model that works for a very long combination of covariates, like male, with age between 20 and 30, with a particular level of education, but also with particular type of attitude preferences and so on. That's impossible to imagine yourself that group is there, because you will have to figure it out that there's a combination of all these covariates that creates a group that simply you have no idea it exists. Okay. So essentially the first implementation was that the key aspect is how the splits are created. And the idea here is something of using a function to measure the parameters instability. So how much the parameters of your regression vary, okay, across different people. So in this case, what you have to think about it is like you're running regression for each individual, and you find out that a certain group of people, they have parameters values within a certain range that is different from another range of another group of people, and then it's different from the range of another group of people, and so on. So there are different ways of estimating this, the parameter estimation, but usually, and the nice thing is that you can use this to really all form of regression, from ALS based on maximum likelihood to quasi-ML to other kind of estimators. Again, there have been some development into this, and I mean, there are a number, let's say, of possible estimation of this. And the parameter instability can be assessed in probabilistic terms. Okay, how likely it is that you find that variation of parameter differences in a kind of normally distributed possibility of the parameter. Can be, if you wanted to do it more fancy, that is not normally distributed, and so on. So here there's a bit of the details how this is done. So normally people use this generalized M fluctuation test to capture the instability essentially of the betas. Okay. So it's cumulative deviations in the betas values by subgroups of individuals. And I'll leave this for the more, let's say, technically oriented. I found it amusing that it's based on a Lagrange multiply statistics, being in a place they do the Lagrange award here, and Lagrange is from Turin, so that's a mere coincidence, to be honest. Now, you can put constraints to the segmentation criteria in your recursive partitioning algorithm. For example, a typical question that one might ask is that, don't you risk there's some kind of overfitting? Because you might end up at one point to have, keep splitting and splitting to the point that you have models for like 10 people. And actually, without constraints, although again, it's an empirical case that can happen, but you don't know until you test it, in the sense that it might be the case where, and I found myself in the case where you just have 2 splits and that's it, because simply there isn't the kind of diversity or heterogeneity that you think there might be. In other cases, you might find a lot of heterogeneity, more than you would expect. Okay? So clearly to have models that describe the behavior of a tiny subgroup is not terribly useful. Okay? But you can put constraints saying essentially that you can say, well, stop looking for splits once you reach subgroups of size n. Okay? Because for whatever external reason, let's say you want to suggest policies for groups, you know that groups, they need to be of a certain size. It's not that you do policy intervention for groups of 10 people. But if there are 200 people, 300 people, then it's a different story. Now, I'm sure most of you might have thought, okay, this is all cool, but definitely has one problem, which is, in order to really exploit all this, you need big data sets. And the answer is true. And actually, if you combine big data sets that are as much as possible representative of the general population that you're studying, that's even better. Okay? So the idea here is that people in the social science, they used to build samples out of their survey design tradition. You can do large samples, and on top of all of those samples, apply these techniques. And in addition to that, for those who do experiments, you can do experiments on large samples admittedly mostly online experiments, so there are some limits to that. So what I do is usually do online experiments on large representative samples in different countries, and then analyze the data through this type of techniques, okay, to maximize, let's say, the worth of this. But in theory, you could do it also with field experiments. You could do it too, I mean, pretty much. So we apply this to the case of COVID, where we tested some interventions to improve vaccination uptake some time ago. And of course, we found that certain interventions on what we call the average treatment effect of these interventions worked okay-ish. In some cases, it didn't work. What we found out, I was part of this group of people. I said, well, let me try to apply this stuff, on this data. This was a large study funded by the EU, 8 countries, large samples and so on. And I said, okay, let's do this. And what we found out is that, so when you apply this, everything we said to, in a condition where you do an experiment, so your model is nothing else than a model to detect your, if you don't do the splits, the average treatment effect. If you do the splits, now we'll see that actually what you get are conditional treatment effects. In fact, then if you put it, let's say, in the language of the groups, they are local treatment effects, okay? And what we found is that some treatments that, on average, they worked, although they were not terribly powerful, for certain subgroups of people, they backfired. They actually decreased willingness the propensity to vaccinate against COVID. Now, imagine that in a condition of public policy. That's information you want to know, because what you're doing is you are promoting some interventions to promote some kind of general good, common good, and for most people might work, but for a subgroup of people actually will have the boomerang effect of reducing their intention, in this case, their vaccination uptake. So you get this problem that there are certain scenarios in which you really want to pay attention about the heterogeneity. So in this case, what we are basically saying is that you can use recursive partitioning-based methods to harness heterogeneity out of your data in order to understand better the nuances of how, in this case, treatment effects apply to a population that's very diverse. And while you're doing this, we are going back to the first question, how you group people. Well, because we have these local models represents people, okay? And these are groups. And the nice thing is that you don't have to think in advance who these groups are. The groups will emerge out of the heterogeneity that is generated by your either treatment testing or your model describing whatever type of behavior they're doing, okay? So that's why at the very beginning I split, this approach. I can say, well, that's a group of people that give a lot of importance to attribute 1 and 2. That's another group of people that don't give a damn about the first 2 attributes, but they only focus on attributes 3, okay? You start to get that, people, so to speak, think alike in the sense that they respond in the same way to either experimental conditions or treatment, or if you have observational data, somehow the same statistical description of their whatever output variable applies to them compared to other groups, okay? Now, it's more difficult to say, there are some implicit attitudes tests that you can use for observational data that will try to tap into implicit cognition, like EIT or concept association task or stuff like that. So, in theory, you can think about cognitive styles and groups related to cognition, again, also on observational data. But that's, again, this is something that people are debating. In conferences, I'll go to a conference in September where we have an entire session on this stuff, and people probably will bang their heads in one direction or the other. But I think that's a lot of a frontier. From a real-life domain application, I think that, at the very least, it helps you to do 2 things. One is that if you realize you have a model that generates a lot of splits, it's telling you, well, wake up, sir. there's a lot of heterogeneity here you're not considering, and maybe your model should be revised. Second is, if that is an intervention you want to be based on that model, be aware that some people will respond very differently to what you might think, and maybe it's worth go and study those subgroups of people in more details to understand why they produce different results. Because you know they are. They would be described by the combination of covariates that generated the split in relation to your model. Okay? So you know who these guys are. Okay? So I think that is, it's an interesting point. Here basically I'm saying the same stuff. I think I reached the point where there's always the moment of shameless self-promotion. So I just wrote a book that does that, which basically the idea here is that combining online experiments and these methods in order to analyze this stuff. It's for Sage. It's kind of cheap. You find it in libraries. I don't know how you get it. I mean, nobody gets rich with academic books. We know that. So it's just because it's easy to explain everything in one place. Even articles usually focus on specific parts of it. You can do an article of 250 pages. So these days they give you 5,000 words. So it's a bit a challenge to summarize this stuff. I put some references here that of different stuff, just to give you an idea. I mean. So even in sociology, people are starting to accept this. So, why don't you see it? I'd like to do. No, you don't. Mystery.
Maybe you should then accept it if we screen on the slide.
Okay. So this is an example of people applying, see, sociological effect heterogeneity using tree-based machine learning, which is exactly what was going on. Okay. So the area, now, they've been used a lot also in the medical domains, because the idea is you want to identify, I guess the adjective here is not quite right, but personalized treatments in terms of medicine. In this case, it would be more like group-based type of treatments. So there's a lot of application in that. That's the collab stuff that I prepared for you, where you can see then all the stuff a bit. And then I'll just share it with you. Now, there are some people, I know that you've been doing networks, right, as well. Some people are applying this even to networks, okay? So, where your model is no longer a statistical model in the, as I described it so far, regression and so on, but network models. So, recursive partitioning of network models. Now, I've been playing around with this, but I'm not confident to give a lecture on it. But that's an interesting development for those of you who are interested into network stuff. Okay. And I think we reached 10, 15. I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions and comments. And please.
So can you help me understand better why would the advantage of using the partitioning within the models and not a priori? So using k-means or hierarchical clustering or something like that, and use to feed the models with the groups already, or instead of discovering the groups within the models?
Because in the first case, when you apply any kind of cluster technique, okay, you are grouping cases, okay, based on usually a set of variables, okay, and not on a model, okay, not a statistical model that represents, in this case, let's say, in an experiment, how people reacted to something, or in observational data could be how that represents what are the most important determinants for people to do X. Okay. So in this case, what you're doing is creating groups based on a statistical model and not grouping the. When you either cluster people by cases, okay, like clustering techniques, or you cluster variables, factor analysis. But here we are in a different domain. Here we are creating groups from the bottom based on the fact that one model performs differently among different type of people, and we try to group them because that model will represent better that group of people and not others. Okay? So it's a different approach. Okay? Because what you will have in a k-means, okay, you have only groups described by averages on certain variables, but not by a statistical model. Okay? Like a regression. Okay? Any other question? I was either very clear or totally obscure and nobody understood anything. Normally, Flamini, do you have any question?
No, no. Well, it's well.
No.
You asked, so I have a question. Of course, if you want to get a question, I have.
What was
so
the name of the wine we drank yesterday?
The name of the wines. The names of them. No, those I remember very well. No, question is that when you apply this to a representative sample, which is built already explicitly to represent groups of people, I see some possible,
Good question.
whereas if you apply to a non-randomized probabilistic samples already representing groups of people, because the sample is built to be a representative sample of the population, is more powerful in terms of discovering.
Well, I get your point. So I think the problem there is that even when you build a sample, you do it on a stratification of variables that you know.
That you know,
Okay.
not about cognitive
Exactly. So obviously, in this case, you don't know stratification. So, but let's say chances are that as at the end of the day, the groups are determined by this set of interaction of covariates. If you have a sample that is built to be as much as possible representative of as many covariates as possible, but let's say the main ones, chances are you capture enough diversity there to see if the diversity exists. Because again, it's not that the splits will create anyway. You might have a case where splits just don't appear because there isn't diversity. Okay? Now, if you apply that to a non-representative sample, the risk is that you ended, because you didn't consider the usual stratification, you might end up really with a huge overrepresentation of one on one. And then, so you might not have a split because you are only in one group of people that think alike, or maybe two, and others are just not there. But that's a good point. In fact, I was thinking about how these methods interact with sampling techniques. In fact, it's an area which I'm kind of investigating here. That's a good point. There was a
I was thinking if you can give us an idea of what is the Bayesian extension of this, and what are the things that can be done better applying Bayesian methods to this.
I think that the advantage there is that essentially has to do with the fact that you can play with distributions. So you attribute distributions to your model, all the different type of distributions, and that, beyond the fact that, of course, because you estimate confidence interval in this case, okay? But they are the frequentist approach to confidence interval, not the credible interval. Plus, I'm let's say, the beginning of my career as a Bayesian analyst, so I'm not going to pretend I'm Bayesian expert. But you can see the fact that you can play a lot with the fact that you can take some data and then simulate if you would have different type of distributions. And so you have simultaneously the estimation of the groups, of the parameters variation, but also your estimation of the distribution of the parameters. And I think that's an interesting case. But again, I'm looking into it. Some people are. I think the implementation is a bit less straightforward than let's say the frequentist approach. I guess that's the reason. But that's, I guess, where the meta-learners approach, because the meta-learners is you move from single model recursive partitioning to multiple models recursive partitioning. So you compare the performance of different models. And one could be, you could do, a linear regression, frequentist approach, linear regression, Bayesian approach, for example. Although that won't change much. And of course, I don't know how the kind of priors play into this in this case, but because I've seen the only example with non-informative priors. So. But I guess you might. One or two. She was fast.
So I just want to understand, like, what if there is any example, like, after the partitioning or the segmentation in some groups that actually very, like, the sample size is very small. And then, like, do you, like, pick them out later, like, ignore them, or do you still try to pick them?
Yeah. So again, in this case, normally, there are not that many applications of these methods nowadays in the Science Advanced paper with the, as we were analyzing in this case the treatment effects for vaccines and so on, we put a constraints in terms of only considering splits. I mean, you can actually put constraints saying stop when you reach what are called terminal nodes, so the bottom nodes with an amount of cases, and then you stop at that level of depth. Okay? So let's say you started to have some hundreds of people in those groups. That chances are that those are interesting groups to explore. You simply are not interested in the case, but again, this is a domain of application because in the case of medicine, they want to know even the small into two. So you have a case where you're doing some kind of experimental detection of determinants of a behavior. It's not about treatments. You want to understand how people do things, okay? And then you use your social ecological context covariates, okay? And then you get different models. These are the local models, the splits. I call them niche because personally I think this heterogeneity needs to be explained in a way, and I use a bit of a kind of evolutionary biology term, meaning that if people have adopted a common strategy to take decision making in certain as subgroups, it might be because that is kind of adaptive to their socioeconomic niche there. Okay, but this is work in progress, let's say, because the concept of niche, even in evolutionary biology, is complicated. But in the easiest scenario is when we do a treatment, because you do a treatment, okay, you get your model of treatment, then you have the local average treatment effects, and so you have the different effects of your treatment in subgroups of people that you didn't know those groups existed beforehand. Okay. Now, in the first case, you could do this in terms of observational data. So, in fact, the model-based recursive partitioning, so the first example we see, in fact, what you're using is a statistical model to describe whatever outcome. No? So that can be based on observational data. Okay? So it doesn't have to be based on, in this case, the other option where we talk about treatments, about randomized experiments. Now, if you are in the randomized experiments domain, then there are some adjustments you have to do in order to make a sound causal inference about the treatment effects that you're testing. So that's why you move from the model-based recursive partitioning into the causal tree thing. So it's the same technique, but with a more causal inference framework. This is a debate a bit in behavioral science, which some of you might not be interested, but basically in behavioral science, where people do treatments, so interventions to modify people's behavior, people are starting to do that a lot, okay? But they've encountered two problems. The first problem was that very often you have the effect size of these interventions tend to be small, okay? It's not always the case, but tend to be small. And the question is, why small? It's small because you fail in the intervention selection. So out of many possible interventions, you pick one that doesn't work, okay? Because normally you can only test a few of them, okay? Or there's some other problem, okay? And the answer of the community there has been, okay, maybe it's really an intervention selection problem. So people started to do the so-called mega studies, where they test a lot of interventions simultaneously in order to say, okay, out of 50 different type of interventions, these are the top 2, the top 3, and so on. So you can make sure that identifying some interventions that they work, okay? So that's one approach. My approach is more like, wait, I mean, you're all measuring only average treatment effects. So before you go and scale it up to testing all possible interventions, let's find out actually if your intervention really failed for everyone, or actually you have within your data subgroups in which it kind of worked and others it didn't really work, and then on average what you get is a small effect size, but you want to find out why it worked for certain subgroups and not others. Okay? So it's a more, I would say, parsimonious approach, let's put it this way. Probably due to the fact that maybe we don't get super mega grants like in the States, where you can do studies with, I don't know, 300,000 people. And so we make the best out of what we get. So we got this issue of, this is what I was saying, so we move from ATA, average treatment effects, to understand better heterogeneity of effects. And I think this, the application of computational social science does that. Now, here we encounter, however, a potential theoretical issue, okay, which is this one. So if we apply these partitioning methods, okay, what we are saying is that we got one model that describes people, let's say, decision-making process, okay? And then we look for variations, okay? Let's call them mutations of that model. We are still bound on the fact, okay, that we're using one model, okay? In the sense that it's still very important and rich that you get, and actually it should point you to revise your model afterwards, that there is one starting model, and then you see a lot of variations, and maybe that means you should change your model, okay? So it points you, it really helps you to revise also the theoretical part. The other point, however, is someone could say, well, but what if groups have actually different models to do things? How you do this? Okay. And this is a debate how to do it. Now, if you remember, I told you about the CART approach, the Bayesian, and then the meta-learners. The meta-learners are for that. So you can test different models, okay, and make them, so to speak, compete with each other to see which one is the best descriptor of different groups. But of course, that means it's more data greedy, it's more complicated, and still people are working out how to do this, okay? But bear in mind this approach. So there are obviously limits. So at the moment, what we have done, we moved from ATA to conditional average treatment effect, but where conditional average treatment effect means conditional to very complex set of covariates that you don't know beforehand, because they're data-driven. Okay? So if we are in the behavioral tradition, people used, I mean, it's not that they were not aware of conditional average treatment effects, but they used to do it in a very simple way. Again, I do my experiments, okay? I calculated the average treatment effect, and then what I do is I compare if the treatment effect is the same between male and female, or old and young. Okay, so simple groups comparison, which, you know, it's an issue because if you do this, you have to consider about the issue about standard errors in group comparisons and so on. So there are some let's say, concerns about this. But what you can do is, if you do the conditional average treatment with the approach we discussed, then you can take control of this stuff, and you do something called an honest tree. So what you do essentially, and the honest tree is another word, just for the sake of getting more and more terminology, of causal tree. It's called honest because it's honest estimation of causal effects of your treatment. Because what you do is, you essentially don't estimate your model and then the splits on the same data. You split them in the logic of training and testing data. Okay? So essentially, you do the same thing on model-based recursive partitioning with the addition of the splits of training and testing data, in order to have an honest estimation of, if you are in the context of experiments, causal estimation of your treatment effects. Okay. So you can do this, and then again there are some aspects. Now the interesting point is that if you compare it with how much other methods, because it's not that there are not other methods to capture a bit heterogeneity. Lasso, for example, regression is one example of this, or selection or LS. How good they are in capturing heterogeneity in your data, particularly in this case in experiment. What we found is basically that honest trees or causal tree are actually much better than lasso and post-selection or LS, and even better are causal forest, because what you do there is you grow a lot of trees and then you pick. I don't know if you are familiar with random forest, but the logic is slightly different in terms of just having one tree. Yeah. So that's why random forest plus causal tree, causal forest. Yeah. And there are examples of this. I mean, I recently wrote a paper where basically what I do is I simulated RCTs. And this is an example of a causal tree where you see differences, the same covariates are with great leap of imagination called C1, C2, C3, and so on. And basically you see the splits of what we say. But most importantly is that if you try to look at some scenarios that are simulated, is that in the first scenario what we have is some normal and non-normally distributed covariates, C1, C2, and C3. And we simulate a binary treatment. In this case, axis would be our experimental treatment. And so what happens is that these are plots of the heterogeneity treatment effects due to conditional to each of these simulated covariates. And so these are the treatment effects values. Okay. So what you see here is that there is a lot of people that will stay within certain values, and then other people they deviate quite a lot. The same there. This is if your covariate is not continuous, but it's a categorical one. So you have two clusters of people. Okay, they respond differently to your treatment effect, and so on. And again, you can simulate the same with a continuous treatment, and you get, again, a lot of different heterogeneity there. So the interesting thing here is that you start to understand how complex is the interaction between your treatment and all the, let's say, characteristics your individuals have, in order to identify groups that you didn't even know they existed, okay, in response to your manipulation. So how you do this? Well, luckily for you, now people have developed both Python and R solutions for this. So it's fairly straightforward to implement. And in the R framework, probably the best package to do this is called causal tree. There are some examples. It's fairly easy syntax, easy to use. Here I put some example again as notes then for when you want to do this. And I explain a bit about this stuff. In Python, I think that's really the best package, EconML. This is a package that does a lot of stuff. Okay, does many different implementation of not only recursive but also the most advanced stuff. Okay, so it's a really powerful package, and I have prepared a couple of Colab notebooks where I use this, which I'll put as a link in the slide, where you can go and copy them and run them on your own local machine. You just have to install EconML and then the usual Python libraries for stats, basically, the standard ones. Which basically will generate some of the charts I showed you before, some of the stuff I showed you before. So what is the advantages of doing this? I think if we go back to the initial questions, is either if you are in the observational data framework or in the experimental one, what you learn applying these methods is that you can use this hidden heterogeneity to identify groups of people that they use the same cognitive style, because in an experiment, you can design an experiment so that you try to understand what kind of heuristics people, or what kind of decision rules people use to evaluate something. Okay? So think about the example I mentioned at the very beginning about the choice experiment. Okay? If I see splits due to variation from covariates in the model that describes the choice that people make, okay, so the importance of attributes, I'm interested into this. But let's say that for us the challenge remains how you identify cognitive schemata, okay, and how then you segment people based on the fact that they have a particular cognitive schema. So people have started working on this. And in this lecture, I'll talk about what is my take on this, which, by the way, is by no means universally accepted in the sense that I send out papers about this, and some people might like it or not, but we did apply some of this stuff in real, say, empirical work cases, so, and it bears some good results. Now, these are the kind of challenges, really, so that cognitive schemata can be explicit and implicit. So people decide, often having clear in their heads what are the, let's call it, rules they use to decide and okay, to evaluate things, but in other cases can be implicit. Okay? People that do behavioral research know that very well because there is then an area of research that is meant to exploit these differences. For example, people that do nudging. Okay? So, just to give an example, some people might rely on the heuristic called social proof. If something is done by a lot of people, it must be fairly good or fairly reliable. Okay? We use that all the time. You go on an online platform, you search for products, what do you look at? Reviews. If a product has a lot of reviews by a lot of people and the reviews are positive, even though you have never seen that product, you never touch it, you cannot trust the fact that others have done so and they've done positive reviews, so you probably buy it. Obviously, these platforms know that very well, and they implement the reviews exactly for this purpose. Okay? And that's an heuristic that it makes kind of sense. Now, some people rely a lot on this type of heuristic, others less. Okay? So you have to imagine the fact that people will have a set of decision rules, and they will employ them in different contexts. And what you want to find out is what decision rules they use, and if people can be grouped based on those decision rules. And so we have, we talk about cognitive styles because we have cognitive schemata that are shared by a group of people. Now, if you start a talk like this one with social scientists that are particularly devoted to this topic, a long debate will start about the relationship between the neurological level, the cognitive schemas, the cultural schemas, and so on, which maybe we'll come back later if you really are interested. But let's say there is a way how we combine all these levels, okay? But we'll set aside. So what is the idea that basically I'm trying to sell? In a nutshell, is this idea that now what we can do is take a way to detect these cognitive schemata, okay, normally using an experiment, okay, and then using whatever identification we are able to do through the experiments, which obviously will take the form of a statistical model that represents, okay, the results of our experiment. Okay, so give you an example. I don't know if you ever came across about choice experiments. Choice experiments are experiments where people have to choose between two options, and each of these options have a combination of attributes, and these attributes have different levels, and people have to do many different choices, and through that, what you can get is how much people give weight and importance to each attribute when they make choices. Okay? And at the end, what you get is a model that tells you the relative importance and weight, in this case, the statistical weight of each attribute in order to increase the probability of a choice of one of the two options. Okay? It's a conditional logging model, in fact, okay? Because the outcome is yes or no of choice. Okay? So the idea here is that if you have this model, okay, and you assume that there will be people that will have different set of weights, okay, but you want to group them in a way that you identify people that have similar strategies of evaluation in this case, okay, how you do this. And we'll come to that in a second. So you're moving to develop first a general model, how, in your experiment, people on average kind of evaluated things, okay, how important they were. And then you decline it into local models. So models that they are fine-tuned to specific groups of people. Okay? But the problem here is that you don't know this group of people, who they are. Okay? So how do you find out this? Well, you put into the picture I call them socio-ecological context covariates. So covariates variable, okay, that in combination with the overall model that you have done this, will tell you if a combination of these covariates will create the groups, here I call them niches, that identify these groups. Now, this sounds very, say, abstract, and now we'll come a bit to how we do this. Because that's the computational social science part, which we didn't have before. So what we have here is, in any computational, let's say, social science areas, say computational computer science applied methods, we have some methods that are particularly well suited to identify heterogeneity, because this is what we're doing, in fact. What we are doing is take a model and see how it performs not on the entire data set that you have, which we would normally do running any analysis, but also how it performs relatively to subgroups within your own data set. Okay? But these subgroups can be only identified from a bottom-up approach, so data-driven approach. So how we do this? So we use partition-based methods and their evolution. Now, there are different takes to this, and there is also a kind of Bayesian interpretation of this, which I'll skip because usually people that do Bayesian statistics are fairly minority and considered weird and discriminated, which I disagree completely. Actually, they should be cherished as swans or rare animals. I've been advocating to hire a couple of Bayesian statisticians in my department for a long time. Maybe I'm getting there. Flaminia knows about this type of struggles. But okay, let's say I actually think that some of the Bayesian version of this stuff are actually very, very interesting because you think distributionally now. But anyway, but we will focus on the cart, which are, we will see the classification and regression trees, but their evolution. I mean, the classification and regression trees are just a starting point, something that probably most of you might have already used. And then, okay, the latest frontier are meta-learners, which are, however, really, I would say, computationally demanding, and I'll explain you why that is the case. So the actual techniques that are really important to us are causal trees, and they're, say, blending with random forest, causal forest. Now, however, in order to understand how these things work, we can go step by step, kind of building the complexity of these tools one step at a time. So the first one is classification and regression trees. I guess all of you have used this. I mean, at the end, what is classification and regression trees? Just a mechanism for an algorithm that partitions your data sets based on a variable that you consider your output, and then you see the conditional distribution of the value of this output variable to certain covariates that you set up, okay? And if your y, so to speak, is a categorical variable, then they are classification trees. If it's a continuous variable, they are regression trees. So in this case, you have, I think that was income, okay? This is income. And this is the form of employment that you have as in this case, a person. So the idea here is that conditional to the covariates of gender and age, what you get is the form of employment changes because if you are male and below 62, you tend to be in full time. If you are female and below 60, you still have a lot of people not in employment. That's evidence of what? The gender gap in employment in certain countries is still a problem because they don't work and they do, housework, for example. Okay, so very straightforward. Now, what you already can start to appreciate is that it's the combination, the interaction between covariates that gets things interesting, because you might expect that there is a difference between male and female. I mean, you don't need a partitioning algorithm to tell you that, okay? But what exactly is the cut point age where this manifests in the biggest statistical terms? That's already a bit more difficult to guess, okay? And the same goes to the case of income. Here you have, again, gender, you have age, and you have marital status, if you are single, married, and so on, okay? So what you get is that, essentially, if you are male and you are below 43, you have that level of income. If you are above 43, you have a bit lower, but kind of slightly different distribution. If you are female and you're single, kind of close to the males, but there is an age gap here, kind of thing. And if you are not married, if you are married, you go down in terms of income, so you work less and so on. So what this very simple approach is telling you is that, look, if you look at all these conditional distribution based on more and more complex interaction of covariates, you get a very nuanced picture, because you see here at the end of this, these nodes, they have numbers here. These are a group of people, okay? So you can say, I can go there and study node 6 community, okay? These are 7,000 people that have this particular distribution of employment, or in this case of income, and you can go into the details. So far so good, right? I mean, you probably have encountered cart methods. So the next step is to say, okay, we got this, but if we're looking at cognitive schemata, it's not enough to have one variable and its conditional distribution to whatever number of covariates, as we've done before. Remember that here we have done all these trees on one variable, income, and your type of employment, okay? So that's the Y, so to speak. So what if we do this for models, not variables? Okay? So what happens if we take a model and see how this model conditionally performs in subgroups determined by complex interaction of covariates, okay? And this is obviously not a trivial thing to do, but not an impossible. So we move from CART to something called model-based recursive partitioning, okay? Which is the daddy of causal trees, daddy or mother, causal tree, and then causal force. We come to these are special cases of model-based recursive partitioning. Okay? So what is the idea of model-based recursive partitioning? So the idea, I found it back in the day when I encountered this approach very interesting, because it's one of those cases of methods, okay, that they combine, okay, the small groups. So that is really a question of domains. In the area where I work, we think about groups of a sizable entity. Okay? But then again, the question is, what is a group? I mean, but normally, if you think, because you use kind of, I call them socioecological covariates, you want a group that kind of represent a group of people that is some sort of potential community there. Okay? So that is something that I guess it will depend a lot from the domain of application of these methods.
Yeah, I have two questions, but I will start with the first. Well, if I got it correctly, the big take-home message and the big advantage is that in typical, say, experimental research or econometrics literature, people do conditional average treatment effect, but they do so on preselected observed covariates, and they might miss some complex combination that can reveal some patterns in a data-driven way that are consistent with some cognitive scheme or some behavioral way of proceeding.
Correct.
But my question is, here, this complex combination of conditioning is done still with observable variables,
yeah,
while the behavior and the cognitive schemes are still latent, right? So is there an implicit assumption that this complex combination might represent actually something like a latent cognitive mechanism or cognitive scheme that people have.
Okay, the measuring of the scheme might is not latent in the sense that it's an explicit model you're testing, and the measures that you have might be sort of, they might contain some, let's say, explicit measure of behavior or decision making, or some implicit ones, but they are not a latent structure like in a SEM model, so to speak. Okay, so but it's true that the covariates are all covariates that are measured, obviously. So they're observable covariates. The question here, however, is that, yeah, the assumption here is that the combination of the covariates that are observable create a group that has, it's not that it's latent, the group, because you know that the model you're using at the global level describes them better than other groups, I mean, the variation of that model for their subgroups. So you are saying that there is an unknown relationship between that set of covariates and their interactions and the variation of the global model that fits them better than other groups. Now, I don't think people consider that as like a latent group, you know, in terms of doing, I don't know, latent class analysis or that kind of stuff. So as a not observed, because it might be function of as, it really depends on what the covariates are actually. But it might be a function that they are in a situation, context of decision making, that all these groups react in a particular way. So it's not necessarily a group in the sense of a static group, but it's just a condition in which you find those people responding in a particular way. So I don't know. I suppose you could call it as sort of latent groups. But usually when people use latent group, they mean there's a latent construct that explains the grouping of those people. And I'm not sure that that's the right word for that. So I haven't seen people using that terminology for this purpose. But yeah. I mean, here in the sort of, because the point here is that in the title of this talk, I mentioned this is an emic approach rather than an ethic approach, ethic without the H. So emic approach means the unitization of your unit of analysis, in this case, comes bottom up rather than top down. So at the moment, you're only in the position to say, well, I found that my model for these guys performs differently. These groups are defined by n characteristics of covariates. Why this is the case is the next step. And in fact, I mean, if you find someone who is, let's say, a more rigid interpreter of what it means to a cultural group or stuff like that, that's not a cultural group. They just share, these characteristics. But there's other people say, well, okay, what do you mean by culture? Culture means sharing cognitive schemas or not. So there's a debate there on one of the many debates that characterize social sciences. So in cognitive sociology, they have this fairly fragmented view of what culture means. So the idea is people have a common culture because they share cognitive schema. I'm simplifying a bit, but that's the idea. So that's why if you do something like that, it kind of speaks to the fact that you identify the cognitive schemas shaped by a group, and then so you're saying, well, you see, I found out it's called subculture that I didn't know was there. Okay. If you mean by culture as a coherent picture, then no, then it won't be. Okay. Anybody else? Well, coffee break it is.